All right, good morning. You can hear me? Okay, great. So thank you for hanging in there with us for this last presentation of the morning. I'm going to talk to you about some of the work we're doing at the Immersive Virtual Environment Testing Area, which is a research facility that is housed in the NIH Clinical Center, which I direct. We've been around for over a decade now, which for those of you who are familiar with the recent emergence of virtual reality as a consumer technology, that might sound like a really long time, but people have actually been using virtual reality in research for maybe 25 years now. So we do a variety of things. Our primary goal is to help researchers, not only myself, but a whole host of researchers at NIH to integrate technology into their research programs. There we go. So what I like to do when I talk about our research is really start with the why. We talked a little bit yesterday about not using technology for the sake of using technology, and that is really baked into everything we do in the Avita. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we use virtual reality for research. I think some of these are applicable to using virtual reality for practice as well. Hopefully you'll see the links. Happy to talk more about it later in the panel. So the first and primary reason that I like to use virtual reality for research is that it reduces the trade-off that we typically see between control and realism, right? So I can have research that happens in a clinical environment where I know everything that a virtual provider, say, is going to say because we programmed him to say it, right? So every participant in our study gets the same experience as the next participant. So it allows us to have great experimental control, thus great internal validity. But at the same time, this is happening in a clinical environment that looks and feels psychologically realistic. It also allows us to simulate complex or impossible scenarios. So just to give you an example, I can have a virtual human and I can change that person's gender, change that person's apparent race. I can change anything about them, which obviously we can't do with a real human. We also have a slate of enhanced behavioral measurement opportunities. So I can collect all sorts of very granular data about someone's behavior, when they do things, what they do, that are very difficult to collect in real-world environments. And we're starting to do a lot of really interesting things with that really granular data. And then finally, these things are portable and distributable. So I don't need to bring somebody into my lab to look at this virtual clinic research experience. I can bring the research experience to them. So I think the best way to really give you a sense of why we use VR in research is to give you some very concrete, specific research examples. Because I'm standing up here today, I get to give you examples of my own research, so I'm happy to do that this morning. And one of the studies that I first did when I began the lab was in the domain of healthcare communication. And we were interested in how a patient's weight influenced physician trainees, so in this case it was 3rd and 4th year med students, how it influenced their treatment of that patient and the decisions they made for her care. So in this case, we were very interested in weight stigma and weight bias. So what we did was we created this virtual person named Jennifer Taylor. And these two versions of Jennifer Taylor are identical in every single way. What she says, how she says it, her nonverbal behavior, everything is identical with the exception of her body size. So this allowed us to study how medical students made decisions for and treated Jennifer based solely on her weight. So I'll give you a couple examples of the kind of data we were able to collect in our VR simulation. One of the things we were very interested in was their visual contact behavior. So this is a proxy for eye contact, which I'm sure everybody knows is very important in clinical interactions. So what we can see from these data is that when Jennifer appeared to be a lean patient, our med students made more visual contact with her than when she was obese. We also were able to ask the med students about their attitudes about Jennifer. So remember, this is a virtual human, but yet these med students developed all sorts of attitudes about Jennifer and how likely she would be to actually adhere to their medical advice. And indeed, they believed that lean Jennifer would be more likely to adhere to their advice than obese Jennifer. So basically, our results are suggesting that patient weight status, isolated from absolutely every other possible confound, elicits biased behavior and attitudes from physician trainees. Okay, and this is not something that you can look at in a real-world clinical environment. So the next step, of course, is to look at how to then go about mitigating and reducing some of these biases, which is some other work that we've done since. And then I also wanted to point out, since we're very interested in the sort of training to practice gap, that we are starting to move beyond these sort of research scenarios to figure out how to apply these controlled and realistic VR interactions for evaluating training situations. So we have a project going on probably as we speak right now, where we're looking at using these sorts of VR simulations to evaluate how well a pharmacogenetics training is working among nurse practitioner students out in California. So I'll give you one more example just to give you another sense of some of the other sorts of things that we use virtual reality for in our research. And this is a more sort of public health behavior example. But another thing that I'm very interested in my research is how telling parents about their child's risk for obesity later in life might influence their behavior. So in this case, I'm very interested in parents' feeding behavior. What kind of choices will they make for feeding their children? I also have another sub-study. So I'm a social psychologist by training, and I'm very interested in the sort of cognitive and emotional mechanisms that might underlie some of this behavior or behavior change. And so guilt is one of the mechanisms I'm very interested in. So to do this, we created the VR buffet, which you can see here. Again, very controlled buffet environment. There's no, there's not going to be social comparison with another person in front of you who has a huge amount of servings, on their tray. There's not going to be, sometimes the lettuce looks great and sometimes it looks terrible. The people see the same buffet every time. And we also have a great array of behavioral measures. So we know when people take things, the order in which they make their choices, what kind of time delay happens in between choices. So we have all of these great behavioral data to work with that you can't really pull out of a real buffet environment. So here I would like to, hopefully, there we go, show you a quick video of what it looks like from the perspective of a user. So here we're looking around our VR buffet environment. And there's an array of foods. All of these foods were chosen to be palatable to children and things children would eat, but yet have a great array of calories and nutrient density and things like that. So a parent basically goes around in this virtual buffet and makes choices for their child's lunch. So far we're doing pretty well with being healthy. Let's see where it goes. Okay, so those are, you can't read the labels because of the video quality, but those are pizza bagel bites. Those are chicken nuggets. Although we have some nice grilled chicken that was available right next to there. I've got mac and cheese on the end next to some white rice. And then we also have drinks available. Oh, yeah. Can't leave without a brownie. Or two, perhaps. This is actually an older version of the buffet where we had condiments available. We decided to devote the space to something else. But and essentially then they choose a drink for their child, and there are all sorts of typical drinks you might serve to a child, and also parents usually have the sense not to do their food. So okay, so that gives you just a sense of what that looks like. And for those of you who are thinking, well, how do we know that what they're putting on their tray has any relationship to what they would do in a real-world feeding environment? We have just completed a validation study where we show that the servings that parents make in the VR show the same patterns as the servings they make when we bring up real food for them. So just to give you a sample of the data that we can show here. So on the y-axis of this graph, you're seeing calories. So we have information about all of the kinds of foods on the buffet and what a serving of each food means in terms of all sorts of nutritional profiles. And so one of the common outcomes we look at is how many calories end up on that tray. And so for parents in our control group, which got food safety, and in this particular intervention, the other control group got behavioral information only, so just sort of childhood obesity, let's wring our hands kind of information. We see similar calories. For those who got family history based obesity risk for their child, we do see a reduction in the number of calories that end up on the tray. But really interesting for me as a psychologist, if you look at that group where there's the one parent, Those are groups where the mothers in the trial were told that your child has one parent who's overweight, which is leading to their increased obesity risk, and P.S., you are that parent. So those are the parents who could not sort of diffuse the blame, so to speak, for increasing their child's risk with the biological father. And so we also looked at sort of the emotional side of that, and what we found was that those mothers were feeling a lot more guilty for passing down that genetic risk to their child. And luckily, making healthier food choices in the buffet, however, was associated with lower levels of guilt. So they were able to sort of reduce that guilt by actually making a behavioral step of feeding a healthier meal. So I'll sum up here, but that basically just gives you a sample of some of the types of research that we do in the AVITA and how we are able to determine the influences of some of the key factors in our research and how they shape responses to health messages. We, of course, are trying to do this in a setting which has experimental control, also psychological realism, and where we're able to expand our array of behavioral outcome measures. And the hopes are that this research will generate communication strategies and approaches that we can bring into practice, but also generate some tools that may, in terms of VR tools, that may also be able to make the transition into practice settings or into training settings. And so I'm going to acknowledge my collaborators, and I'll stop there. Sure.
Do we have any questions for Susan?
I thought that was interesting. We've done some research on that, but my question is, if I understood this correctly, you were focusing on predispositions to some extent and not the actual behavioral cues. Are you going to be adding cues later on to see how they have an impact on behavior?
In terms of the buffet?
In the behavior, or just food choices?
Yeah. I mean, so that is sort of a long-term goal of ours, is to look at maybe using the buffet for maybe intervention-based training, or to, be able to look at how elements of the built environment, say, or of the buffet environment might influence the food choices that people make. We already have done some research on how the elements of the buffet as designed influence the choices that people are making, but it'll be interesting to be able to manipulate some of those things, which is typically fairly trivial to do in this kind of environment.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Other questions? Leslie.
So similar to that, I'm Leslie Taylor from the Athletic Training Strategic Alliance. With the body size difference, kind of following up with the follow-up to that, have you considered doing any type of like everyday bias education that would then see, does education on intentional bias, or I mean not intentional bias but unconscious bias, does that impact then or decrease the difference in say body size and communication and interaction?
Yeah, so I come from the Genome Institute, and so one of the primary things that we look at is how communication about genomic factors in weight influences bias. And in actually the very same study I presented, we have some data showing that those medical students who learned about heritability and genomic factors in weight did show quite decreased levels of bias in the same setting, and so I'm sure something longer and larger would be needed for longevity. But we are also just starting a project where we're starting to look at bias reduction in terms of racial bias. And so we are starting to work in some of those areas and building a VR tool to measure how the intervention influences the outcome. So yeah, we have our hands in there in a lot of different ways, but it's something that I'm really interested in as a research topic. Thanks.
Probably have time for one more question for Susan. Anybody have a question? Go ahead.
Hi, Miguel Paniagua. I'm from the National Board of Medical Examiners. I'm leading a study right now that we're looking at patient characteristics in our exams and seeing how if we change overlays for specific case vignettes, for instance, a 55-year-old that presents with chest pain, if you make that a male versus a female, black versus white versus Latino, how are students choosing the next best step in management based on those characteristics? Your VR takes it to another level because it's, in fact, you're viewing a patient as opposed to try to conceptualize from a vignette. I'd be interested in how you think that might have a role in not just the assessment of potential biases related to patient characteristics, but also how it might help in the instruction and retraining of some of these folks.
Yeah, so that kind of literature is a lot of what we built from when we did this. I think being able to sort of view the patient as he or she is, it takes away a lot of that sort of very specific, like, oh, well, okay, now I'm dealing with a female, so how should I be thinking about that? Whereas you just kind of have a female in front of you. So I think it does allow some of those more implicit things to work a little bit better. Yeah, and I do think that there've been some work with some of these more training-oriented applications where you can then sort of give feedback to people and say, this is what you did. Now, this is what you did when the patient was a female, and this is what you did when the patient was a male, and let's look at that and let's compare and see whether that's clinically appropriate, right? And so I think that there definitely would be a role for including these kinds of things in retraining people. In the study that I talked about, we did actually have a whole decision-making arm of it. And we did find that when we presented our patient as obese, but talked about genetics, then people started to say, well, maybe we won't give her, a dietary evaluation, or maybe we won't refer her for, exercise, exercise evaluation. And so it was really interesting to see how even just bringing in some of these different facets of the patient and different explanations for her condition led to really big differences in the recommendations they were making. And part of me would have loved to just follow up with these students and say, well, look what you did here. You should probably know this, but of course it's a research study, right? So I'm going to hope that their education has taken care of that for me. But yeah, I would love to see a lot more of that in training.
So please join me in thanking Susan Persky for a great presentation.